Here we go. Jessica, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to another meeting of the Slavery Archive Book Club. We are here with and to discuss Sophie White's amazing book, Voices of the Enslaved. Love, Labor, and Longing in French Louisiana. Um, Before that gets started, we are here also. I just want to make sure I introduce my co hosts. We meet on a regular basis, as you know, Wednesday around this time, so we can discuss new and exciting work in the field of history of slavery. African diaspora. I am joined by my co-host here, Alicia Arujo, who is coming to us from Harvard University. And we also are co-hosting, and we have our other collaborators, Alex Gil of Columbia University and Vanessa Holden of University of Kentucky, who just got tenure. So if you see her on the internet, please do wish her congratulations. So yes, so with the four of us, we co-host the Slavery Archive Book Club, an amazing community and a really exciting endeavor. And I'm very excited this week, especially to bring in my colleague and someone whose work has really inspired and been so important to the work that I do, into thinking about the history of the US, the history of diaspora, the Caribbean, the Atlantic world, and of Louisiana, Sophie White. We're going to discuss this beautiful book. Look at this beautiful cover. This beautiful book today all together. As you know, we will begin with a little bit of an intro from Professor White, and then we will open it up for questions and for discussion. We are broadcasting here on Zoom. We are also broadcasting on YouTube. So if you have questions or if you want to watch, or if you're watching on YouTube, please know somebody is watching the chat and you can post questions there. You can also, if you are watching and not able to be on Zoom or YouTube, you can send us questions via the Slavery Archive hashtag Slavery Archive, all one word, on Twitter. Somebody will also be watching there. So looking forward to really rich discussion about a fantastic award-winning book. We will start off with Dr. White, Professor White. Please welcome to the book club.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate that generous introduction and also the opportunity to join the book club, and so grateful to the co-conveners and to those of you who've showed up today. And I wanted to let you know that the book, the hardback had sold out, but I just heard that the paperback is out today, or at least it's in the warehouse. So I'm really excited. I think it's a good sign. I thought what I would do is speak briefly about the genesis of the book, my approach to the archives, and the methodological interventions I make, and then welcome, of course, your questions. I guess at this point, the book came out at the end of 2019, and last year, I'm glad it was written before COVID happened, but last year, it seemed to have had quite a nice level of success, and I'm still a little startled by that, especially in terms of the book prizes and the Frederick Douglass in particular. And so I have spent some time thinking about why it's resonated, not least with that range of interest that it's generated. And it's a book about enslaved individuals in 18th century French Louisiana and how they narrated their lives. Being focused on the French Atlantic means that it necessarily reorients some of our perceived knowledge about early North America, which tends to be dominated by thinking about the English colonies. But above all, it's a book that reveals sources in which individuals tell us about their lives in their own words. And in narrating their experiences, their words return over and over again to their humanity, to their suffering, or actually more often the suffering of loved ones, but also their attachments, their animosities, their sense of humor, their sociability, their relationships, their emotions, their loves, and their longing. So it's also really a book about voices, but also inevitably about silences and about archives. I like to start talking about the book by quoting from Annette Gordon-Reed, who posed a question that's so frustratingly familiar to those of us working on slavery. And she was writing about 12 Years a Slave, the film that came out. So it's a few years ago. Quote, which historical sources should be deemed legitimate? These questions are particularly fraught when one is dealing with past atrocities like America's racially based system of chattel slavery. Then there is history's cruel irony. The individuals who bore the brunt of the system, the enslaved, lived under a shroud of enforced anonymity. The vast majority could neither read nor write, and they therefore left behind no documents, which are the lifeblood of the historian's craft. Unquote. This problem of source material is seen as especially acute in the period before the rise of autobiographical slave narratives like 12 Years a Slave, or beginning with Equiano's 1789 autobiography. Those published sources do offer richly textured first-hand accounts of the experiences of enslaved individuals that showcase their voices even when mediated by editors. And of course, much ink has been spilt analyzing those. But it is too easy, and it has been too easy, to elevate these particular narratives as canonical, to make of them the default autobiographical slave narrative. Because largely lost in that canonization is a very simple fact that autobiographical slave narratives of that type are a literary genre, a very particular type of writing that explicitly linked abolition to Anglo-American Protestant traditions. And as such, they emphasize a trope of Christian conversion and personal redemption that did not resonate with French or Catholic anti-slavery advocates. So they didn't commission any of these published slave narratives. And consequently, there are none in France or her colonies. And so to make of that literary genre the gold standard for slave autobiography, which I suggest has been the case, can blind us to other potential archives in which enslaved individuals narrated their lives. And one of the offshoots from the research on this book is a volume that I edited that came out in 2020 with Trevor Bernard on slave testimony in French and English archives and colonies. And eventually I'd quite like to do one with French and Spanish archives, or French and Portuguese, where we have that sort of commonality of Roman law and also Catholicism. Voices of the Enslaved delves into one such archive that I suggest offers an alternative access point to autobiography, autobiography writ large. In colonial Louisiana, the archives are brimming with the voices of African and African descended individuals, as well as some Native American ones, within narratives overflowing with personality, with character, with subjectivity and humanity, in which they often seem to quite literally spring to life. And I'll have a few examples to show you. And so, though my book includes trials from Louisiana primarily, it also includes trials from the French Caribbean and Mauritius, which is my birthplace, Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, a former French colony as well. But primarily it's based on the archives of the Superior Council of Louisiana. And there are approximately 150 individuals enslaved individuals who testify in approximately 80 trials dating between 1723 and 1769, when Louisiana ceases being a French colony. It's not at first glance a particularly promising archive. There are fragments, these are moments in time, and they're certainly highly problematic. And I tend to think of this as a sort of example of testifying while black. The decks are entirely stacked against those who testify. But at the same time, these do offer an alternative set of historical voices and life stories that can give us access to the words, the thinking process at least, and the perspectives of individuals for whom we have precious such evidence. And as they spoke and narrated in court, and this is very important to understand, Their words were systematically and very precisely recorded, down to the inclusion of dialogue, of turns of speech, of metaphors, sometimes even passages in Creole. And so I brought one example here of Marguerite, who starts the book, said that she'd run away because her master and mistress always beat her, that when she fell sick, her mistress came to see her after 4 days and said, "Mademoiselle is playing at being ill, is she?" And right then beat her with a stick, made her work to clear the courtyard, and threatened that if she didn't work, she would call the other slaves to take her to the public square to give her 100 lashes. Notice that even this sort of passage where she's mocking her mistress or quoting the mistresses in the text is included. So when I talk about, the accuracy with which this is recorded, this is one of those examples. Marguerite carries on to talk about, she carries on and said that every night they locked her up like in a convent. Also says that she'd run away to this cabin of Jeannot. She identifies as Congo, and therefore we certainly know she's not born in Louisiana. And just that comment about every night they locked her up like in a convent, I think opens up so many ways of trying to grasp how she perceived the environment she landed in. She arrives in New Orleans, likely the first place she's seen a convent, and she's confronted with a model of women religious who are cloistered, kept away from men, and seem to voluntarily be quite happy to be kept away from men. And here is a woman who herself has known captivity, who's been through the Middle Passage, who is locked up at night. And I think through just that little phrase, I get a sense, and I hope my readers, I think we all get a sense, of seeing through her eyes how perplexed she must have been to encounter this extraordinary Catholic model of sexuality that locks religious women away from men. Many scholars have worked on this material, including the absolutely brilliant Jessica Johnson. And I myself had worked on them for years, and I probably should say decades by now. And so had been very familiar with this archive until one day when I thought I was writing a certain book. And there was one day when I realized, actually, no, I'm going to be writing a totally different book. And pretty much went back to square one. And that's my aha moment. And my aha moment was rereading a trial from Natchitoches, actually, and this young man is interrogated. And as he's answering a question, the scribe suddenly said, he's written down a page of answers, and then the scribe who's writing it down said, and then Etienne said without being asked, and it goes on for another page, and then the scribe says, and then Etienne said again without being asked, and it goes on for another page, and the third time, and you can tell from that scribe, and then Etienne said on his own volition without being asked, and I realized something really important then. One of them was that this archive, the record keeping is key. Etienne could go on as long as he wanted, and that scribe had to write it down. And the next thing I realized is that actually these tangents, Etienne kept going off on tangents that weren't particularly to do with the court case, many of which were incriminating, but that were random. He liked eating donuts. There was eating of grilled chicken. I mean, all sorts of elements that really had nothing to do with the court case. So I went back and looked at the trials again and realized that there was another story to be told here in terms of how important this archive at recording what's spoken, but also at understanding that the French legal system allowed deponents to go off on tangents. And this is very different to what you would find, for example, in the English colonies, where for the most part, the enslaved are not even allowed to testify. And certainly the records are not the same. They don't have the same purpose. So, from that moment, I realized I had to reorient my specialization and become a sort of semi-expert in French legal history, which took many, many years, and it culminated in a chapter now on judicial procedure in the book. And so just to say a few points, access to testimony was regulated by slave codes enacted for France's colonies, but The existence of written records of testimony is a function of French legal procedure, and especially France's 1670 criminal code. And the process and the rationale of this, to begin with, the process for recording testimony is pretty standardized across its colonies, and having now looked at trials from various different parts, I can attest to that. The French legal system, and this is important, held that confession was the queen of proofs. The theory being that only the defendant or only the guilty knew that they were guilty. And this allows for a huge place for that listening to testimony in court, but allowing for those tangents, but also for the importance of recording the testimony as it is spoken. And very briefly, you know, there's a shorthand version that's done by the scribe. It's read out to the defendant or the witness or whoever speaks. They can make corrections, which they do. We see it in the archive, and then they produce the longhand version. I'm always happy to speak more about that. I want to bring one other example. One of the things that when they write it down, it is not exactly, of course, what is spoken. The clerk usually turns it into third person. He doesn't include punctuation, often doesn't even include accents. And yet, I want you to just listen to this text. And of course, this is my translation. This is just a witness, a bystander. Deposed that the night of the 8th of this month after work and after the sun had set, the deponent went into the cabin of Baraka, where he usually goes. He found the wife of Baraka, who was shucking corn, that her husband having entered at the same time, he said to his wife, "I'm hungry, give me to eat." That the wife immediately left her work to give him the gruel she had made, that he began to eat and said to Mamuru, who was there, to eat with him. That Mamuru began to eat with him, that the wife of Baraka continued to shuck her corn, that Baraka, having eaten, said to his wife, "Give me my pipe so I can smoke." To which the wife of Baraka answered back, "Do I have the pipe? I don't know what you've done with it." That he said to her, "Well then, give me yours." That she answered him back, "Go get it from where it is behind the barrel." And having gotten the pipe, he began to smoke, scolding his wife, "You too whore for me." That at that point, the deponent said to him, "Why always you scold your wife like that? It is not good." That seeing that Baraka didn't say anything else, he went to bed. I've highlighted in that text the dialogue. In the French, you don't see any of that. You don't see those quotation marks. I've included them because once you start seeing that and you get used to that kind of linguistic analysis, it's clear that we've gone from third person to speaking directly and dialogue being quoted in this text. And so you get the sense, as the scribe is doing his best to keep up, of that immediacy that is so important to capture and that is captured over and over and over again. And so what we have here are these metaphors, these figures of speech, and here in this case, a rare sample of Creole. And so, which I've done my best to translate. I'm fortunate that I'm a native French speaker from Mauritius and a native speaker of Mauritian Creole. So I get very excited when I get Creole in here, but you see that immediacy here in that text. So what we don't know is if any of the events described took place, right? Unless we can corroborate it elsewhere. But we do know that what is recorded in this archive was a pretty accurate rendition of what was said in court. There's no reason for the scribe to start talking about, you know, pipes, etc., unless he's writing it down. And I just want to point out, Baraka is a Muslim honorific. This is a Muslim household. The wife is not eating with the men in the household. So we even get that element of detail, right? So I hope that's given you a flavor of what this archive is, which does not detract from the huge, huge challenge of how to interpret those words. So I make a couple of broad interventions in interpreting this material. The first one is that oral speech is subject to different rules than written text. So, for example, a comparison of this to Equiano's, now it doesn't really hold. Oral speech has different rules, not least the effect of adrenaline. And we're back to that immediacy. It happens in the moment, it's spontaneous. It also means it's reactive, since questions are not known ahead of time. And even when testimony is coerced or coached, we have to presume this sort of element of surprise or of having to think quickly on your feet. And I should point out that there are no lawyers in Louisiana, so they really are up there on their own. I don't think we should presume a one-dimensional rationale, not even that of self-preservation, for the answers that opponents gave. On the contrary, there's a lot that is incriminating. And I think it serves us well to remember that these are three-dimensional people, sentient human beings, and they have different, there might be a richer combination of explanations, both intentional and planned ones, for the tangents that they go on and the answers they give. So how is this autobiographical? Well, this is back to not deeming autobiography as linked to a sort of life story that tells us from birth to the end, or published narrative. I think we need to forget that altogether. To me, autobiographical could be as simple as acknowledging the fact that testimony was anchored in the deponent's own experiences and ways of knowing. It's autobiographical because it expressed how individuals looked at their world and how they evaluated it and how they made sense of it. That's why that little element about locked up like the convent was so key to me, to understand that through that line, I can almost see how she's looking at her environment and making sense of that. Appearing before the court provided individuals with an opportunity to narrate their own stories, to digress, to redirect questioning, and to introduce unrelated matters in an arena where, temporarily commanding full attention, they had to be heard. I'm beginning to think of it more and more as this process, not just to do with slave testimony, but as a topsy-turvy, a bit like Masquerade. For a while there, you control the scene, and I've started publishing on that. You control the scene, but of course at the end, order is reasserted, and you know, the judges are supreme again. But in that moment, they hold the ground and they speak. And I think we should be open to the possibility of narrating loss, memorializing loss or other stories. And one of the other offshoots of this research is that I have a digital humanities project that will be launching this fall with the Omohundro Institute. And one of the cases I've selected for that is interesting to the general public because it's the first known reference to voodoo that I have found in these records. But what interests me a lot more is that the deponent wants to talk about the abuse that his wife is suffering at the hands of her mistress. And that is the focus. That is his tangent. That is what he wants to talk about. And it's important to me to pay attention to those moments. And so when they're redirecting and going on tangents, I think the payoff for us is huge to actually also follow those trails and see where they're going. And they often seem totally extraneous, often completely irrelevant, and yet I think they're deeply revealing and very often riveting, because above all, we have this sort of these trials in which they testify, these individuals testify certainly as defendants and possibly as accomplices, but also as witnesses and very rarely, of course, as victims, so a range of people appearing. It's a book in which I had one other example that I wanted to show you, which is, I think sometimes we almost get to the point where we sense an implicit critique of slavery in some of these words. Oh, I think I cut that one out. But in this, the epilogue in which an individual, François Xavier, comes across a soldier in a terrible act. And he talks about the fact that if the soldier had been a slave, he could have you know, stopped him from doing it. But he talks about, but I knew that I couldn't say anything or do anything, so I went away very quietly. I think that to me is an implicit critique of slavery, and I think that comes up a lot in terms of the respectability, the morality that comes through and shines through the way that they present themselves as quite often morally and ethically superior to some of the colonists that they encounter. So just to finish, that, you know, this is a book about individuals in their own words. They tell us about themselves and their experiences, whether they tell the court something of themselves, and how they handled being enslaved. And the book showcases 10 of these individuals with many others scattered through. I began with silences, and I want to end there too, because I do feel the weight of, so much scholarship and thinking about how problematic this sort of source material is. But I want to end with Leslie Harris, who reminds us, quote, that the idea of silence, which is often used in discussions about early African-American history, in fact, can undermine the significance of our projects of historical recovery by implicitly positing a perfect archive. And against that notion of a perfect archive, we'll never get anywhere. We'll always fall short. And so for me, as with Leslie, there is no, and so many others, there is no such thing as an ideal or a complete archive, but nor do we have the luxury to imagine one. So I mentioned the Digital Humanities project that will launch this fall. And I know that Professor Johnson also has something in the works, and I'm so excited about that, because I think those of us who work on this material just get so excited and always want to proselytize and let others think about the challenges and maybe disagree with interpretations and find different things there, but at least find things there. And so I like to conclude talking about the book with the last few sentences of the book. Their courtroom narratives lift these individuals from anonymity, even as their stories underscore the heart-wrenching banality and the violence of slavery. Sometimes we can trace the arc of their biographies through other records, but mostly we only catch sight of them for brief moments in time. Yet here were real people who lived full lives. We are the richer for having encountered them, however fleetingly. And whenever they did have the opportunity to speak and to have their words recorded, we surely owe it to them to listen and to try to hear. Thank you.
Yes. So exciting. And you're right. Whenever we get into this topic, anybody who does this work and is been in this archive and is enthralled and haunted by this archive, as those of us are, we get together and then we just want to talk about it. And we want to ask all kinds of questions and get really in the weeds with it. And I have all kinds of in the weeds questions, but I won't ask those. We are open. The queue is growing. We have some questions already. If you have questions, please raise your hand. Don't be afraid. I am going to kick things off with a question that is. So I have two questions. One is a very, very big question that goes back to some of the ways that you're relating the stakes of the method and the genre that you have created and are engaging with in this book. And that genre, of course, is 19th century English, written in English, but US and UK slave narrative, right? And you're doing a lot of work in the book to decenter that as the project of Black testimony by formerly enslaved and free people of African descent. And I was wondering if you could situate us even more in that. Come join my project against Anglophone sources, supremacy, and say a little bit more about what is it like? What more can we gain? You mentioned other sources, Portuguese and Spanish. Like what are the stakes of decentering that as the genre, as you're saying? Give us more of the stakes. Let's do more with that. And then the second question is actually really specific. It's about the love chapter of Kenan and Jean-Baptiste. And I just was curious if you talk about how you encountered them and what it was like to write about them. I think there's so often that we get into these particular archives, Slavery's archive, and a lot of it is very painful, hard, and is violent, and it just is, and it needs to be related as well. But we also then get these kind of glimpses into the effective lives of the enslaved, and the choices, the conscious choices they're making to have particular kinds of intimate lives and partnerships. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the experience of finding that source was like, and what it was like to kind of be able to bring them into the world through that chapter.
Thank you. And thank you so much. Well, I mean, I've been at this for a long time now. And to your first question about, the weight of the model of this autobiographical published slave narrative, which I think is really part of my broader and your broader and our broader exercise of saying, hang on, the English model is not the only one, but it has been so influential. And I have 2 decades worth of going to conferences, writing, my first articles being told, no, could you, yes, we know it's on Louisiana, but actually, could you do a big section to compare it to the English colonies, in the way that no one working on an English colony would be asked to compare it to what's going on in Louisiana, right? So I think there's an element of that, and we're still plodding in that direction. But I think more fundamentally, it's, that might have been the genesis of my interest. Doggone it, I'm going to sort this out. But I think it really is a case of, it blinds us. It blinds us to what's there. It's any kind of canonization does. To be honest, I started out being someone who works on visual and material culture. There's also the canonization of the written text, right? And what about the nonverbal? I mean, there are many ways in which we need to see evidence in different ways. So I think it speaks very much to that project. Especially working on North America, I want to let people know who haven't thought about this, that we do have this different kind of testimony, and to pay attention to it. But it also means understanding how it is shaped, and therefore the French legal codes, the slave codes, the French judicial structure. You can't do that work without having all of those elements. And so I'll leave that there. It's a huge project. But I think it's important because I think, yes, most fundamentally, it does blind us to seeing things that we might otherwise have spotted. To get to the love story, I mean, it's a 14-year love story, at least 14 years. And I came to that chapter late. It's very difficult to pick the cases. I wanted to end with it. I always knew I wanted to end with it. Well, get the epilogue and the weird story there, but I wanted to end with that story, partly because it's one of the few in which we have women talk about their relationships. We have a lot of men talking, a lot of enslaved male individuals talking about women, and I gave an example earlier. I think it was important for me, even though it's fairly brief, to have that element. And beyond the archival work, which was quite convoluted, as so much of this is, because of course there's the trial, and then there's the sort of endless amounts of looking through every other possible archive I can think of to find traces, track down genealogies, work out, all of these little elements, and then work out the spatial element. So this couple, for 14 years, they tried to be together. They are owned by different owners. And so as part of that, trace the record of, he's trying to get his master to buy her. She's trying to do the same. It's not working out. I mean, we even have the prices that they're offering. And they run away a couple of times. So we have this evidence, and they end up living in a cabin for about 8 months on their own. And the thing that struck me the most, and I think, Jessica, this will resonate with you, it's when you see that line, like with Marguerite, it was, and they locked her up like in the convent, as well as the mocking of the mademoiselle and everything. And for this one, it was that both of them, when they described the moment when they were captured, each separately, because they're not in the same courtroom and they're not in the same prison, each said, we were captured at midnight or whatever it was. underneath our bed, in our bed at the door of our cabin. They each had a variant of that, and it was that possessive. They were and it just broke my heart. This was their cabin. This was their bed. This was their marital bed in a way. And they'd had 8 months of living apart. So the chapter then goes on to become about household labor and all sorts of other questions, but it was that moment of claiming that space that was meant so much for me. And I'll say one more thing about that before I moved on. Our dear colleague, Professor Emily Clark at Tulane, said to me, well, Sophie, if you're going to understand this story, because at some point they have a perilous crossing from Lake Pontchartrain to Mobile, and they have to go through this area called the Rigolettes, which is actually where Emily Clark grew up. She said, I have to show you the Rigolettes. And she took me. And I mean, I'm getting chills now. It's terrifying. That past is terrifying. And to see that, and to realize how much they fought for it. It doesn't leave you reading that kind of testimony. It doesn't leave you. Next question.
It's a lot. It's a lot. I mean, but that just shows how rich the testimony is, you know, and that it's there. It's absolutely speaking back. We have a question from Ivan. Do you want me to read it, or you want to come on video? I can always read it.
Why don't you just read it? I'm in my paper correcting uniform, and I don't want anybody to see me.
Okay. I understand that. So the question is, can Sophie speak on plessage? Were there cases in the 18th century when the, quote unquote, gentlemen refused to keep their bargain? Maybe the Black woman in the situation did not keep their bargain, so there was a case brought against her. Could you just speak generally about what you might have found and how that might speak to plessage?
So there is no formal plessage in the French colonial period, which goes to 1769 in Louisiana. It will show up in the early 19th century with the arrival of refugees from Saint-Domingue, etc. But I stop at 1769 when the colony becomes Spanish, and there is no formal plessage of the kind that you find at Saint-Domingue, etc. That's sort of a very formal system. So none, but which is not to say that there might not have been either informal arrangements of that kind, but I think more likely I'm trying to think of the best terminology for this. So the easy answer is there's no formal plessage, therefore there are no sort of agreements that we can find, and people breaking agreements or not. Certainly snapshots here and there of, there's one, and I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but it's a totally different court case, and at some point there's a reference to a man coming to visit a woman by the river, and he's white and she's not, and there's something going on there. There's certainly prostitution. I think I know, Jessica, you've worked on this. They're subtle points, but they seem to be quite clearly going in that direction, and a language that is recognizable as alluding to those actions, as well as, of course, the absolutely ubiquitous abuse of enslaved women within the household by slaveholders, etc. Right? So that goes without saying, but you get an element of payment and favors, etc. But not formal arrangements.
Thank you for that. We have Michelle McKinley asking one of the questions that I held back. So I hope that you'll ask this question, if you like, on video. Oh, you are here, you're on video, hello. Okay, so I'll put you in spotlight. And good to see you.
Hi, everybody. Sophie, I was wondering if, you spent a lot of time talking about the ways in which side comments were incorporated. And I was wondering if, so in the Spanish context that I know much better, notaries have blank sheets of paper that then the copyist would kind of transcribe onto. And I was wondering if there was a similar process going on in which maybe somebody who was more conversant with the Creole that enslaved people would have spoken would have been able to sort of triangulate that with the formal notes, or whether the person who was taking the deposition would have been fluent in both French and African Creole. It's a very technical question, but I mean, you spend a lot of time sort of talking about the way that testimony gets incorporated, and I'm just wondering how cacophonous the process is.
And no, I love those kinds of technical questions, right? Because I think they open up ways of thinking about it, and either corroborate or tell you we're completely on the wrong track here. So two things. One, in terms of procedure, I haven't seen any of these first drafts. They just don't survive much, these shorthand drafts, but there's some medieval ones that survive. And in terms of a training, and so then we've got another question of how well trained are the scribes in Louisiana. But the comparisons of these shorthand versions to the final longhand version that makes into court record, they're like really meshed onto each other. And so the analysis of the medieval ones, there might have been some Renaissance ones as well, show this really, it's the same hand and it's the same process. And what we find in Louisiana is the ultimate. So I have one that I put in the book because I loved it so much after reading back. So do shorthand and then go back and read the testimony. And that's part of the, and the deponent, any deponent has to approve. Yes, I said those words, and they can make correction. And there's one where the scribe puts it, we crossed out the word said and put this instead. And, there was one extra syllable, so we removed it. There's that. And there's also the moment, it's rarer, where someone said, no, I didn't say that. I said this. And they can also change their testimonies. It's not a question of saying, no, it's purely, they can change their testimony, but this is really correcting what had been said before. We don't know as much about what's going on in Louisiana, but we do know one thing, which is that there are no new ships bringing slaves from West Africa after 1731. There's one in 1748, and there are a couple of sort of illegal shipments. But the population after 1731 is increasing through reproduction, and it's also increasingly creolized. So most of the trials date from, there's some from the, there's some earlier ones, but the big chunk is in the 1760s. So in terms of language, we've got two things going on. One is that most of the enslaved people in Louisiana can speak Creole or French at least. So because we've also then got the problem of interpreters, right? And if someone doesn't speak, you've got that level as well, and they do bring in interpreters. But I think as someone who is from an island that speaks Creole, I suppose maybe I don't second guess that so much, because anyone who's lived, we all understand Creole. And it doesn't take long for someone who's arrived, a French person to arrive in Mauritius to kind of understand most of it, or at least to be able to write it down in that phonetic way. So and sadly though, so I think the bigger process is understanding and changing some of these words and Frenchifying more often rather than retaining the Creole. The Creole is retained very rarely. But in one of the passages I showed, when he asked for the pipe and the wife says in the French, it's eh ben, that's a real, it's a very colloquial form of French that's included in the dialogue when the dialogue's included. That's very different from the more formalized that sort of shapes it. So that's the kind of stuff I love getting into. and spending time sort of thinking about and helped, thank God, by my language skills and degrees in French literature. But, you know, really important questions. And I think working on Mauritius, I have on those archives, and some of the Louisiana, looking at the Martinique and Guadeloupe ones operate slightly differently.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Questions as we wait for no waiting any longer. So you guys don't want me to ask and get in the weeds of questions with Sophie White, because you know how we will get. Professor Araujo, you're up.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie, for this beautiful book. And I love the fact that you bring this idea of this work on testimonies, and bring back this discussion about the slave narratives. Those of us who have been working on other parts of the Americas, where then in Catholic societies, we have faced this context in which we find these testimonies in the archives, and they are often very, very rich, but it's still this usually is not considered as slave narratives as a genre as we have in the United States, but of course everywhere. Then in the archives written in Spanish, in Portuguese, and in French, we have narratives that are narratives. Then people are telling a story, even though, of course, we have the layer of these individuals who filter then, because, of course, these are not, these are narratives. At the same time, they are testimonies, but they are not totally firsthand, because those were giving these testimonies, they were not those writing. And these are questions that often they come to us. I did work on archives in the south of Brazil that had similar testimonies, and always the question was about those were the intermediaries who took these testimonies and wrote down, especially, of course, when these testimonies were women who were given them, and those who were taking the testimonies were men, those who were writing them down were men. These women and men could often be illiterate. Then it's very important to bring this here, and not then in terms of even the orality as you bring about these testimonies. But my question would be the following. Then you selected a number of individuals to highlight in your book, and you also selected a number of narratives. Mm-hmm. If this number of narratives are so abundant in your archive, I would like to hear from you why you selected these individuals, and why these narratives, these specific ones, and if you can tell us a little bit about how you made that selection, what cases you left out, and why. Thank you.
So this is why I'm doing a digital humanities project, so I can have a whole other set. I'm going to have, at the moment I have 4, which will be the whole trial. So I'll talk a little bit about that, because I felt, you know, obviously I am interpreting and I'm bringing all the paraphernalia, and I've always wanted to have a parallel project in which the entire trial, I mean, you can read every dull, dreary piece of judicial procedure that you want, but also every answer and see it. And so that people can see them for themselves, and allow them to come to it a bit without my interference in a way. So I'm really excited that Jessica's going to have this. I mean, the more we can get these out, the better. And I'd like to eventually have the ones in Mauritius launched as well somehow. How did I pick them? You know, we have individuals testifying. I mentioned most of them are as defendants, most of the testimony, that these are criminal trials. So we have, you know, when I talk about the testifying while Black, decks stacked against them, this system is meant to incriminate certain people. In France, it would have been the poor. Once we are calling it's enslaved people. And, but we also have witnesses, we have accomplices, we have these occasional victims. And so I wanted to somehow balance that. But I also found that once I'd made my selection, I mean, there are far more males who testify than females. And yet my book has quite a few women in it. And I think at some point I got very drawn to thinking about different registers and different things that can be said. Not surprisingly, one of the things that's not often said or that women don't talk about is sexual abuse. It's the elephant in the room. It's there, and there are indirect ways to get to it. In fact, I used Mauritius archives to think about that. So I think I was really interested in the said and the unsaid, but also the tension between them and exploring that tension. So that, you know, was one direction that informed it. Some people I knew would be in there. Louisiana, who starts it, I've been writing about her for donkey's years, and her corset and her using a corset to claim respectability and morality. And, you know, now that I'm at the other end, I don't know, Anna. I mean, I could have picked a whole other set. And now that I'm doing these other archives, like, why didn't I pick the guy who's talking about voodoo? Because I'm really interested in the fact that he's really wants to talk about his wife. So, and I'm obsessed with that particular trial, which is what happens. Once I decide and fix on something, I mean, I'm obsessed with that trial, and I mean, obsessed, and I just keep thinking about it. And then there are, so it wasn't, at some point I was thinking, is it like cycles of life? You know, I have infanticide, I have birth, I have a love story, I have, you know, was that it? And I tried to shape it that way, and I'm not sure it was that coherent. But I suppose it was moments and trials in which love was spoken about, and more often not longing of some kind, because love is almost the resolution, right? The longing is the often the blockage that can't necessarily result in that. And I think that's the important story too of what is not possible. And I have one regret about the book, and that is that I don't talk enough about violence. I think for those of us who work on slavery, like all of it, we're aware of all of that. It controls everything. I mean, the randomness of, you know, Marguerite saying, you know, the mistress threatening to send her to be whipped on the public. I mean, we know what's going on, but I'm not sure I conveyed that enough in the book as the balance against which to think about the trials. So, I couldn't have, you know, these are my people now. I don't think I could have chosen any others for the book. I can't even second guess myself, because it was the right choice to make. But it was an emotional choice, and someone else would have picked. I will say one more thing. I don't think this is a book I could have written as a young woman, not because I possibly didn't have the skills, but just I was drawn to certain narratives. And I think maybe that's my life experience, you know, that is, you know, hard to escape as well. So as a middle-aged woman, this is the product of a middle-aged woman.
Can I, while we wait, in case as other people gather their thoughts, I almost want to kind of like triangulate some of that, because we have so many people who are doing or in comparative archives, even just here. I see Jennifer Spear here, Anna, of course, other folks, and you know, something you said about where and how sexual assault appears in different ways in different archives. Could we maybe talk a little bit about that? Like, how do we, like, how and why is that? Like, what is it about? Are there ways that we can draw a kind of map of like what makes certain archives make that legible, or where is that now able to be a conversation? This came up last week. Was it last week? It feels like it was time is a wild thing. It feels ages ago. But when we had the Willie Glimp here, and Tamika Nunley, Dr. Tamika Nunley, asked about sexual assault, but also prostitution with the camps in the Civil War and more. And you know, it just seems to be, it just is an interesting fact of the structure of how we're able to even do our research, that certain topics are more legible than others. And there's something really genius about the way that you're able to make these comparisons and give, you know, create a methodology where we can refract from one archive into another, what we know was probably happening, but maybe just wasn't written down. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit about, like, you know, why are those differences, and what is the structural piece of those differences?
Yes, and I think, you know, I think we are so used to, and it's no different. Louisiana doesn't have as many letters by colonists other than the ones that appear in notaries, right? We don't have for the French period. We don't have these sort of letters, but we don't have a lot of journals. I mean, it's a really strange place in terms of that sort of documentation, and yet, as with you know, other places, we tend to find a lot of accounts of sexual assault in you know, in diaries or journals or travelers' accounts commenting on it. And you know, the strongest one I know in Louisiana is it's a description of abuse. It's all sorts of abuse, including sexual abuse. And the only reason we have it is that it's in a civil case in which an owner of a plantation is trying to get rid of his overseer. And so he brings to court this sort of claim against the overseer, accusing the overseer of killing his slaves and of causing miscarriages and of raping the women in broad daylight in the fields. And he brings all of this information, you know, hearsay, so-and-so. And then, you know, and he mentions some of his own slaves coming to him and saying, you know, this is what this guy's doing, and he's killed, you know, he's hurt my wife, etc., etc., etc. It only appeared, and the doctors said this, etc., but it appears in this sort of civil case, and the overseer is never prosecuted, never investigated, should have been. None of that happens. We just have it because it's, you know, a case between two men over property and money to be paid. And then it turns out that, you know, the owners know this, the plantation, he's known about this for a good year because he's been writing letters to the overseer. Would you just stop your brutal behavior? Because it's, you know, we can't really get more slaves coming in because it's after 1731, no more ships. And there's all of that sort of detail in that one sort of letter, but there's no testimony that speaks to that in the same way. And while I was thinking about that, I started working on the archives of Mauritius, where they have, they're different, but they have much more like in Saint-Domingue in the Caribbean, maroon communities. And that's where I found discussions of males of African descent abusing women of African descent. And I just remember, well, wait, hang on here. Like, we know where the preponderance of the violence and the abuse is taking place, but it's just in this weird sort of context that there's something not right with that. And so, you know, I expound on that in the book, but it made me think about, you know, it's that elephant in the room that can't be spoken. It's one of the few things I think where I don't see those tangents going off. It's far more subtle. It's far more subtle. And I think it speaks to that, you know, there's some things that one talks about and others that can't, that are either too painful or just, you know, doesn't go there. And I mean, I'd be interested because, you know, Jessica, this is what you've brought up so much on that with the same archives. I mean, and I think that was the moment when I thought silence is eloquent as well. Right? We all know that, don't we? I mean, I'm interested in these words, and I'm, talking about these tangents and all of this stuff that we can find, but I think that it really, they work together. There's a tension there, and the silence is eloquent.
We have Jennifer Spear. Thank you so much. Maybe adding to this, or you have a different question?
And Jessica for bringing this all together, and Sophie for writing this amazing book. I wanted to come back to this question of sources, and I think we've had a conversation about how in the Spanish and French legal systems, the materials are just so very different. And you point out also in Louisiana, there isn't that other set of sources that a lot of people that work on the Anglo colonies work on. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate about your book is looking into the law and why this is, right? Explaining why these different kinds of sources are available. But I want to know if you would go any further. And so we have a set of sources for Louisiana and for much of the Spanish Americas that we don't have for the English Americas. If we had these same kinds of sources in the English colonies, do you think we would be hearing the same sorts of stories and experiences? Or is there something in the structure of these two empires, Spain and France, the way they construct their legal systems, that actually has an impact on the experiences of enslavement?
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Jennifer. And I'm so happy to have a coterie of really important scholars here tonight. I think you have worked on the Spanish in the way that I haven't. I, instead of moving into the Spanish period, went sort of global and went to look, and I'm gonna stick to that. So I always hesitate to speak about the Spanish colonial archives because I just don't have enough knowledge other than dipping in to look for various things. But I think you're right with that. There are some differences. I mean, just well, one difference between French and Spanish is different rules for manumission, right? And different abilities to reach it. That's going to inform whether someone tries for legal manumission in the French period, because it's so difficult to, in the way that it's going to be not, you can't buy your, all these impediments, which mean that whole notion of legal freedom is not going to be available. So that in itself is a fact. And I think for the French and Spanish together, I mean, we have, of course, the elements of Catholicism. We have the right to slave marriage, to children staying within with the mother, at least, if not with the mother and father. I mean, we have those sorts of rules that surely must structure what then becomes the ways of knowing and the knowledge and those things that will seep through in the testimony. So I think on the one hand, we really do have to pay attention to those differences and to similarities, because it's going to, it creates a sort of grid that has to be lived within or fought against. Having said that, I think there is still, on the other hand, quite a lot of commonality. And I think this is maybe coming from that volume in a conference before that on slave testimony in French and English colonies. And we went from 1700 to 1848, and a testimony on Berbice, testimony, and 19th century testimony, mid-19th century, where some of the same concerns that we get little inklings of in the Louisiana record, sort of also inklings here. Negotiations over things and other ways of expressing themselves. I think we probably would find a certain amount of commonality, but bearing in mind also these differences. And we're not even getting into the question, Louisiana, again, not only homogenous in terms of language, but, Senegambian populations, who is peopling the places where the testimony emerges. That has to, just in that testimony of Bahaka, this Muslim household, that has to inform the sort of testimony and the sorts of emotions, feelings, personality, character, wit, what you say. I mean, just thinking about the act of speaking in public, You know, if you're born in West Africa, you know, what are the different models for a woman speaking versus a man? You know, what are storytelling conventions? Who gets to hear that testimony? Who is it appropriate to hear? So I think we'd probably find some commonalities, but I think it's just tragic that there isn't testimony in the English colonies. And I think, and I did have to spend quite a lot of time on that question too, because there is some colonies did allow testimony, but there, most of the recording requirements are totally different. So they don't let the deponents go on forever ad infinitum. And when they write it down, they write the sparsest text, and most of the accounts we have are published in newspapers or pamphlets, and they have nothing to do with recording the trial. It's more, you know, justice was served. No, it wasn't. I was there. Those sorts of questions. So, I mean, good for them that they have these published slave narratives. I'm not jealous. But I'd love to see a project, Jennifer, speaking to your point, and actually to Anna's as well. I mean, I think the more we think comparatively about law and about these sources, when they do sort of somehow match up in a way, I think is really, really, really important work.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We have some space, I think, in the queue as people are thinking about questions. Plenty to think about as far as testimony and language. I think that might be a question that I sneak in here. About language, all right. So I have a question. Well, I was curious, you know, so Michelle asked a question that I had about, that I just wanted you to ask a question about Creole and distinguishing and how that emerges in the dialogue and the rhythm of the testimony. I was wondering about other languages that, you know, you encounter in this archive. Bambara, Wolof, how are people positioned as translators? Who are these other, if we think of other, even not in a way that's like mediating the testimony, but how are these other folks in the community of language and of relating the stories? How do they play into the narrative? How did you encounter them? Yeah.
And so, I mean, it does crop up now and then, you know, someone who can't speak French, and they will find an interpreter, as you say, usually someone who understands their language. But one of the cases that I did use which is this infanticide case, and the only witness is a 10-year-old girl, and she's Native American. And there she doesn't speak French at all. And so there you have a French interpreter who's a fur trader who supposedly understands a language, which is Ottawa, which is not consistent with their allies of the French. So it would not be consistent for her to be, there's something else going on with that story. But what I like about that one is it's a reminder that actually takes us beyond the moment in court about language, right? And the recording and how it's interpreted and written down. Because then in that one, everyone kept talking about, you know, how this little girl who couldn't speak French kept gesticulating. She kept trying to communicate with her hands. The woman she's accused, this girl, I can't get her to do anything. She doesn't understand French. I mean, that it problematized that whole question. But to say that, to sort of move away from that case, but to think about all of the other ways in which we communicate non-verbally. And that is lost. That is lost in the archive. I think as I read the passage and those passages, I think that quite a lot of the personality in the character comes through. I mean, it's still, that flavor's still there, that immediacy. But we still lose a lot, you know. Does someone sort of stop talking for a minute because they're too emotional? Do they talk really fast because they're nervous? I mean, we're all thinking of our students right now doing presentations, you know, the really nervous ones talking really quickly. are they looking aside? We lose the whole sort of non-verbal aspect. Do they stand straight when they talk? Do they cower? Do they laugh nervously? All of that is lost. And possibly, and that is just, so to a degree that the written text can get us there, but there is a problem with that, with a whole world that is lost, that is not even about language and language acquisition. I mean, one of the things that, to go back to your initial question, language acquisition is interesting, because then you also, beyond that, you also see evidence of who gets on with who, various comments, oh, I don't get on with the Creoles, I'm this, or, the voodoo one is, he's, oh, did you go and, yeah, but I went with them, but I don't understand their language. So it comes up a lot, and it is going to be a factor in testimony, less and less as that population creolizes and acquires French, or at least Creole. But I think that whole other aspect of gesture and non-verbal communication is, we can try and find elements of, but that is part of communication too, and that is gone largely.
I mean, and just a quick follow-up, I mean, it's interesting because it's one of the kinds of language contexts and the communication context that you talked about was the other thing that is not supreme. It's not just English as a language, it's also all these modes of communication. And it's a mode of communication you talk a lot about in your first book. I want to get the whole name right. Wild Frenchmen and Frenchified Indians, Material Culture and Race in Colonial Louisiana. So like you are, like in some ways you're still thinking about troubling how we communicate and where we find testimony. Was it a big jump to go from non-text to text, to thinking in kind of non-text as sources, the material, the body as sources, or was it all just seamless?
I think in a way it was like a return. I have an MA in French literature, so I like doing textual analysis. I like to think about text, but I think it's part of the same parcel. I mean, that first book was on material culture and especially clothing as visual. That's why that corset in that case is so important, because when someone talks about an item like that, we can interpret that in certain ways if we know how to do it. But yes, I think it also maybe leads to my initial skepticism about those slave autobiographies, because they're written sources, they're verbal, sure, but but they're written, they're very different. We have to think about, we don't think enough about the difference between orality and what's written, even when we're dealing with verbal evidence. So yeah, I think I see it as a sort of continuum. Don't know what I do next. What have I done? Visual culture, material culture, verbal, non-verbal. But I think in any way that we can complicate again the perceived wisdom that a written source is supreme, just because that's what's helpful to historians. I mean, come on, guys, go and do what Anna does and do some really serious work on visual images and artifacts. And it's not easy to do. It's not easy to do, and there are many pitfalls. But I think, yeah, I like to push those sorts of boundaries too, or to remind, as anyone who's been with me at a conference for the last 20 years, I like to remind people not only about French Atlantic, but also non-verbal. Yeah.
Wonderful. We have a question in the chat that we've been asked to read aloud from Danielle Terrazas Williams. Thank you so much, Sophie. I absolutely loved the book. I was wondering if you ever got the chance to offer the museum the correction regarding the image. If you have, I am curious what their response was.
Thank you, Danielle. So this is the front image of the book, and I do talk about it in one of the chapters for those of you who haven't read the book. Please, it's a bigger image. Her breast is actually out, and I did not want that on the book cover, by the way, and I hope I managed to hide that. But it's a bigger image, and it's in the Musée d'Aquitaine in Bordeaux. And I was there, and its label is two deux femmes antillaises, two women from the Antilles, and I looked at it, and I'm a dress historian as one of my specializations. I thought, no, it's not two women, that's a man and a woman. And it changes, and to know that it's a man and a woman changes it, because from two women, you know, oh, they're looking, you know, doing so well, serving fruit, and actually the hand is reaching over to take one of the fruit, and he's got a stick under his shoulder. To understand that it's a man and a woman, and we've got different sort of elements going on here, changes how you interpret it. So I devote some time in the book to doing this, and one day I'd like to do a standalone article on it, because I think it's the ultimate threat for someone like the white artist who would have painted this. Instead of the fruit being served, you know, someone else is appropriating what he thinks is his. I'm delighted to say that as soon as I did talk to the museum, the curator, and when I had a discussion about having it as the book cover, I told them why and that they had it wrong, and they were wonderful. They were wonderful, and when they got the copy of the book, you know, which of course I haven't read, but they were just so excited, and I gave them a synopsis of my findings. And what I don't know, because I have not been back to Bordeaux since the book came out, and since I told them this, is whether they changed the label on the wall. And so whether it still says two women or whether they've updated it. So it's one thing to be appreciative and to be really excited. It's another to see if they actually change the labeling. So that would be the true test. Yeah. And hopefully, if I can get the funds, I'd love to translate the book in French, but that's another battle.
Excellent. Yes, we want that. Absolutely. We have a question from Chelsea Sieber. Professor, would you like to come on? Yes, fantastic.
I'm on my phone, so I thought I'd put on my screen for now, but you don't want that on the square. Hi, everybody. Hi, Sophie. Thanks so much. So I really loved what you were saying about literary analysis. My ears perked up, of course, but no, because I'm really interested in this idea of court testimony as a genre as well. And I wondered if you could talk about any commonalities that you found, if we could start to sort of think about the specificities of this genre in terms of, you know, yes, the turns of phrase that you talk about, but even the framing. Is there a way to even think about how some of this performance of testimony or the expectations can be mapped out and kind of thought of discursively as a genre? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, I have spent quite a lot of time thinking about, if I'm going to be critiquing one canonization of a particular genre, what's going on in with testimony itself. And absolutely, there is a performance of both on the part of everyone. And whether it's the judges, the fact in this case there'll be no lawyers, you know, where the deponent stands, who is in the audience, actually no one, no juries pronounced. The one thing that doesn't appear in the trial record is the judges' deliberations. They're never part of the record, and they're the ones who make the decisions, not juries. So there are so many ways in which this is framed, including how the questions are, the sequence of questions. You know, the first thing is always, you know, name, age, and qualité, which is sort of loosely translated as status in a way, and usually means, you know, who are you owned by, residence. There's a lot of shaping there that certainly lends itself to being identified as a genre, right? A genre of writing and inscribing. But I suppose that once we understand how that happens, how that mapping happens, what's required, and perhaps it was useful for me to look at trials from other colonies just to see some differences or not. Once that is in place, I think it allows the particulars of a case or particulars of an individual's life to sift up. but you can't go to it with, this is wonderful, I'm going to find everything here. That legal aspect is key. I mean, that is really why I spent years working out what was going on. It was quite tricky to work out what was going on in court. It was tricky. And why certain things were done and why they were done in every colony as well as in France. That was really important. But I think once that's established and you see that genre, it's like with the slave narrative genre of you've got personal redemption, you've got all of these elements. Once you see that mapping done, it allows all the other elements to percolate up. And those are the bits that I hung on to. So if that answers your question, I mean, it's a sort of process in a way. And it does mean, spending a lot of time reading the really dull parts of testimony, and as I'm translating them in their entirety for this digital humanities project, French legal systems don't map onto each other. So trying to find the formulas that would lend itself, but I think that's, for me, one of the only ways of doing it, of making those present, and then seeing what emanates from within that.
Thank you. I'm seeing a French Caribbean cabal developing in which we all band together.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. If there's a burning desire, concern, query. I must say for myself again, like I have 1,000 questions. I cannot wait to talk to you more about this text and about all of the work. I cannot wait to, conspire more with you on getting these testimonies out into the world. Thank you so much for a fantastic book and a really important intervention in just how we do Slaveryarchive and how we do this history. I hope everybody give your reactions, your round of applause, your what is that, the big burst emoji, and congratulations on all of the awards. I did not read them all, so I'm so glad that you had that slide because it's well deserved. The book deserves all of the praise that it's receiving. So thank you. I'm going to pass it on to Anna, who will give updates for next week and close this out.
Thank you, Jessica.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Then just to remind you that this was the book that we had today, Voices of the Enslaved by Sophie White. Just to call your attention that the book was published then in 2019 by University of North Carolina Press, and the paperback edition of the book is out today. Then we have the hardcover, but if you go then to your preferred bookstore or to the website of University of North Carolina Press, you can get, now you can order the paperback edition. And thank you so much, Sophie, for joining us, for supporting the book club. This talk is going to remain on YouTube. And I just want to call your attention because you have, for the year one of this initiative, we still have 3 books coming. Then the next one is going to be on March 19. This is 2 weeks from now on a Wednesday, 5 p.m. The book is, let me see if you can see here, Between Fitness and Death, Disability and Slavery in the Caribbean by Stephanie Hunt Kennedy. This is a book published by University of Illinois Press. And you can get the book already now if you didn't yet, and register by going to the website that is Slaveryarchive. .wordpress.com, and you can register for that. After just 2 days after this session, we have on May 22nd, and this is going to be a Saturday at 1 p.m. You have the book Afro-Catholic Festivals in the Americas, Performance, Representation, and the Making of Black Atlantic Tradition. This is a book, edited book by Cécile Froment. and it was published by Penn State University Press. Then you can get this book that is also out on paperback through the website of the press, Penn State University Press. And thank you so much again for joining us. Thank you, Jessica, for moderating this panel today. And thank you for our co-hosts who have been with us during this long journey, Alex Hill from Columbia University and also Vanessa Holden from the University of Kentucky. And thank you to all of you who came today. I hope to see you in the next ones. And thank you, Sophie.
Thank you.